commencing legal action against Mrs. Meghan Markle. Her televised allegations, particularly the Oprah interview, have inflicted undue harm upon the royal family. An apology no longer suffices. The matter will now proceed through the courts.
The silence didn't break with a shout, it cracked with a whisper. The kind that travels through marble corridors long before it ever reaches the press. The kind that makes courtiers stop mid-step and aides lower their voices. Because this wasn't gossip from the outside anymore, this was panic from within. 5 years after the Oprah interview detonated like a cultural earthquake, a new murmur has begun to crawl out of Buckingham Palace. And it's far darker than apologies, statements, or carefully worded regrets. Because buried beneath layers of protocol, loyalty, and royal restraint, leaked palace documents are now suggesting something the monarchy swore it would never do. Quietly, discreetly, almost desperately consult lawyers over Meghan Markle's explosive claims. A bracing autumn morning in London, cameras flashing like lightning as the palace gates loom large, reporters sensing something off in the air, not a celebration, not a tragedy, but tension. The kind of tension that doesn't announce itself. It hums, it lingers, and behind those gates, behind the tradition and the silence, a question has been quietly gnawing at the heart of the crown. What if silence is no longer enough? Because the Oprah interview never really ended. It didn't fade into the archives or soften with time. It metastasized. It followed the monarchy into documentaries, memoirs, podcasts, late-night monologues, dinner table arguments, and history books that are still being written. Every time Meghan spoke about isolation, every time Harry revisited the pain, every time Archie's name was invoked, the wound reopened, and according to sources whispering now, the king may have finally asked the one question he was never supposed to ask. What are our legal options? This isn't about a lawsuit filed. Not yet. This is about something more dangerous. Consideration, consultation, drafts, opinions, red-lined memos stamped confidential. Because leaked internal correspondence, the kind never meant to see daylight, allegedly reveals that senior palace aides quietly arranged private legal briefings. Not for tabloids, not for contracts, but for one singular reason, assessing whether Meghan's Oprah claims crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. And that's where the real shock begins. Because the monarchy's power has never come from the courts. It has come from restraint, from endurance, from letting storms pass while standing still. Never complain, never explain, wasn't just a motto, it was armor. But armor can crack, and insiders claim that in the years following Oprah, the cracks became impossible to ignore. At first, it was manageable. A statement here, a measured response there. Then came the Netflix series. Then came Spare. Then came the interviews, the speeches, the insinuations that never quite named names, but never let the implication go either. Each new project didn't just retell the story, it sharpened it. And inside palace walls, patience reportedly turned into something colder. Calculation. The leaked documents don't scream outrage, they whisper strategy. Legal language stripped of emotion, asking whether claims made on an international broadcast, claims involving race, neglect, mental health, and institutional failure could be legally challenged without igniting a constitutional inferno. Because suing isn't just legal. For a king, it's symbolic. It's war. And according to multiple sources familiar with the matter, the consultations weren't emotional outbursts. They were clinical, quiet, almost reluctant. Questions like, what constitutes reputational harm at this level? Can implication be as damaging as accusation? Does global broadcast change jurisdiction? What happens when personal pain becomes permanent public record? These weren't the questions of a vengeful father. They were the questions of a monarch staring at legacy. What makes this moment so volatile is timing. 5 years is not accidental. 5 years is reflection. 5 years is the distance between shock and reckoning. By this point, King Charles is no longer the waiting heir. He's the reigning monarch, carrying a crown shaped shaped by history and expectation, watching his institution be redefined in real time by narratives he does not control. And control, that's the word palace insiders keep circling. Because while the public framed the Oprah interview as catharsis or betrayal, depending on allegiance, inside the palace it was cataloged, analyzed, archived. Every claim cross-referenced. Every reaction measured. Not to rebut publicly, but to understand the damage privately. Polls dipped. Commonwealth conversations shifted. Charitable relationships strained. And though none of this was acknowledged openly, it piled up quietly, like paperwork in a locked drawer no one wanted to open. Until now. The leak suggests that the drawer was opened, not to file a case, but to explore the possibility that the monarchy's silence had allowed a one-sided version of history to harden into accepted truth. And once truth calcifies, reversing it becomes almost impossible. What's especially explosive is who reportedly pushed for clarity. Not the old guard, not the courtiers raised on deference, but a newer generation of palace power. Advisors who understand media cycles, digital permanence, and the brutal economics of narrative. According to insiders, they argued that in an era where accusation spreads faster than correction, silence isn't dignity, it's surrender. And that's when lawyers entered the picture. Not filing papers, not drafting complaints, just listening, advising, mapping hypotheticals. Asking the unthinkable question, if this were any other institution, would legal action already have happened? That question alone sent shockwaves through palace walls. Because everyone understands what happens next if that line is crossed. Depositions, discovery, emails, notes, private conversations dragged into public view. The monarchy doesn't fear losing, it fears exposure. And yet, the fact that legal consultation even occurred suggests how close the institution believes it is to losing control of its own story. Meanwhile, Meghan remains silent on this alleged development. No statement, no denial, no confirmation. And that silence is being read in 1,000 different ways. Some see confidence, others see calculation. But palace insiders insist this isn't about her response, it's about the king's threshold finally being tested. Harry's role complicates everything further, because any legal examination of Oprah inevitably reopens Spare. And any scrutiny of Spare invites questions about family, memory, and motive. Sources claim that during internal discussions, one concern loomed larger than all others. Once lawyers get involved, nothing stays contained. And that's the paradox choking the palace right now. Legal consultation offers clarity, but at the cost of chaos. It promises boundaries, but threatens exposure. It could correct the record or detonate it. Which brings us to the most unsettling detail in the leak. These consultations were reportedly framed not as retaliation, but as defensive necessity, as legacy protection, as an institutional fire drill long delayed. Because while Meghan's supporters argue the interview sparked necessary conversations, palace strategists reportedly see something else, a narrative that has outlived the moment it was born and now threatens to define the monarchy itself. And when a king begins to ask lawyers how history might be challenged, it means something fundamental has shifted. This isn't about revenge. It's about whether the crown can afford to let one interview become its permanent footnote. And as these whispers grow louder, one thing is clear: the story everyone thought was over may only be entering its most dangerous chapter yet. If those quiet legal consultations really happened, if drafts were sketched, hypotheticals debated, risks mapped out in rooms where portraits of monarchs past looked down in permanent silence, then the monarchy has already crossed a psychological line, even if it never crosses a legal one. Because the moment a king asks lawyers how to challenge a narrative, it means the narrative has begun to feel more powerful than the throne itself. And that is the part no one is saying out loud. For years, the strategy was distance. Let time dilute the shock. Let public attention wander. Let new events replace old headlines. But the the Oprah interview didn't behave like a normal scandal. It became a reference point, a before and after in modern royal history. Every new project from California, every speech, every anniversary think piece pulled it back into the light. According to palace watchers, that constant revival may be what pushed internal conversations from emotional frustration into procedural evaluation. Not rage, not revenge, evaluation. Because when institutions think long term, they don't just ask what hurts today, they ask what endures tomorrow. And if palace advisors truly sat across from legal experts asking whether globally televised allegations could be challenged in principle, then the monarchy wasn't trying to silence pain, it was trying to understand permanence. What becomes record? What becomes accepted history? What becomes the version future generations inherit? That is why this alleged leak is so unsettling. It suggests the palace may no longer see the Oprah interview as a family dispute, but as a reputational event with institutional consequences. And here's where the tension deepens. Any legal path, even exploratory, risks turning private memory into public evidence. Lawyers don't argue feelings, they argue facts. Timelines, documents, communications, which means a courtroom strategy would not simply question claims. It would dissect relationships, meetings, medical support structures, internal correspondence. It would turn emotional testimony into legal language. And that transformation is dangerous for everyone involved. Because no matter which side believes it holds the truth, exposure rarely leaves reputations untouched. Sources who claim knowledge of palace sinking say this is a nightmare scenario that froze decision makers in place for years. Legal action could theoretically challenge narrative dominance, but it could also unleash scrutiny the monarchy has spent centuries avoiding. Discovery is not ceremonial, it is surgical. And yet, the fact that consultation may have happened suggests fear of a different outcome, doing nothing and watching implication harden into accepted fact forever. There is also the global dimension. The Oprah interview was not a local broadcast. It was a cultural event consumed across continents, reframed in countless languages, debated across political and generational divides. Any legal contemplation would have to reckon with that scale. Jurisdiction becomes complex. Public interest arguments surface. Free expression protections collide with reputational defense. It becomes less about one interview and more about the collision between monarchy and modern media reality. Because in today's world, royalty does not control narrative by tradition. It competes for it like everyone else. Inside palace strategy circles, younger advisors reportedly understand this more instinctively than traditional courtiers ever could. They grew up in the era of digital permanence, where clips never disappear and context is optional. From that perspective, letting one side of a story circulate unchallenged for years can feel less like dignity and more like surrendering authorship of history. But older voices, the ones steeped in the monarchy's long memory, see legal entanglement as a trap. Once the crown enters the arena of litigation over personal disputes, it risks shrinking from symbol to participant, from institution to litigant, from above the fray to inside it. That philosophical divide may be the real story behind the leak. Not whether a lawsuit is coming, but whether the monarchy can survive the modern world without redefining how it defends itself. Meanwhile, Meghan and Harry's public posture remains outwardly unchanged. Their projects continue. Their messaging centers on healing, advocacy, and autonomy. And that consistency, supporters argue, reinforces their credibility. Critics argue it prolongs damage. Both sides claim moral ground. Neither side shows signs of retreat, which means the standoff is no longer loud. It is structural. Every time the Oprah interview resurfaces in media retrospectives, the monarchy is forced back into a position it never chose, reacting to a moment it cannot rewrite. If legal consultation truly occurred, it may reflect not aggression, but exhaustion. An institution realizing that silence did not make the conversation fade. But even hypothetically pursuing legal remedy carries staggering emotional cost. This is not a dispute between corporations. It is a rift inside a family that also happens to be a constitutional symbol. Any formal challenge risks turning personal pain into legal argument and private memory into evidentiary exhibit. That kind of escalation changes relationships permanently, which is why insiders who claim to have seen these internal debates describe them as agonizing, not eager. There is also the generational lens. Younger members of the royal family represent the future brand of the monarchy, one that must coexist with social accountability, media transparency, and cultural critique. For them, allowing unaddressed allegations to linger indefinitely may feel incompatible with modernization. But modernization through litigation is a double-edged sword, because courts deliver judgments, not reconciliation. And then there is the public itself, fractured, polarized, emotionally invested. Any legal move, even theoretical, would ignite global debate about free speech, race, mental health, power, and privilege. The courtroom would not contain the conversation, it would amplify it. Which leads to the most intriguing possibility whispered by those who study palace crisis strategy. Consultation may never have been about filing a case at all. It may have been about understanding leverage, knowing where the legal lines are, knowing what could be challenged, even if it never is. Information as preparation, not weapon. Because sometimes institutions seek legal advice not to act, but to understand the boundaries of inaction. If that is the case here, then the leak itself becomes part of the chessboard. A signal, a reminder that silence should not be mistaken for incapacity, that the crown, while reluctant, is not powerless. Still, the emotional reality lingers beneath the strategy. A father, a son, a daughter-in-law, a family rupture that played out on the world's largest stage. Legal frameworks cannot untangle that. They can only define edges. And perhaps that is why no formal action has emerged despite years of speculation. Because the monarchy is balancing two risks: the risk of being defined by accusation and the risk of being diminished by confrontation. If the leaked documents are real, they reveal not fury, but fear. Fear that history is being written without the crown's voice. Fear that restraint has been mistaken for admission. Fear that legacy is drifting beyond reach. But they also reveal hesitation. Because for all the talk of legal consultation, there is still no case filed, no summons served, no courtroom battle underway, only the knowledge that the option was examined. And sometimes knowing a line exists is enough to change behavior on both sides. For now, the story remains suspended in that uneasy space between rumor and reality. The monarchy watches, the Sussexes continue, the public debates, and the shadow of that interview still stretches long across both continents. If this really is a new chapter, it is not one written in declarations. It is written in consideration, in the quiet turning of pages marked confidential, in questions asked behind closed doors. Because the loudest conflicts are not always the most decisive ones. Sometimes the future of a dynasty shifts in the moments when lawyers are consulted, and no one ever hears what was said.